After 10 days away, I found my entire life packed in suitcases outside my own front door. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife ever could. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. My name is Helen Carter, and I'm 67 years old. The afternoon sun was merciless as I stood in my own driveway, my hands trembling as I held the car keys that suddenly felt foreign in my palm. The familiar red brick house I'd called home for over 30 years stood before me like a stranger's property, its windows reflecting my shocked face back at me in fractured pieces. 10 days. I had been gone for just 10 days. The beach vacation Emily had insisted I take. "You need time for yourself, Mom. You look so tired lately," was supposed to be a gift, a chance to breathe after 5 years of suffocating grief since Robert's sudden heart attack. 5 years of trying to hold our family together, when everything inside me was falling apart. But as I stared at the scene before me, I realized it hadn't been a gift at all. It had been a setup. My belongings, everything I owned, everything that made up 67 years of living, were packed into mismatched suitcases and cardboard boxes, arranged with cold precision on the concrete driveway. The afternoon heat radiated off the pavement, making the air shimmer around my displaced life like a cruel mirage. There was my grandmother's china, wrapped hastily in newspaper, the photo albums I'd lovingly maintained for decades, documenting every birthday, every Christmas morning, every milestone of my children's lives. The quilts I'd sewn by hand during long winter evenings when Robert worked late shifts, all of it reduced to luggage, as if I were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. And there, taped to my largest suitcase, the one Robert had bought for our 20th anniversary trip to Europe, was a single piece of white paper, folded in half. Emily's perfect handwriting, the same careful script I'd helped her practice in 3rd grade, spelled out my destruction in neat blue ink. "Mom, we've moved on without you." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I read them once, twice, 3 times, hoping somehow they would change, that my eyes were playing tricks on me in the harsh afternoon light. But there they were, as final and cold as a gravestone inscription. Moved on, without me. I stood there clutching that note, my legs suddenly feeling like they might give out beneath me. The woman who had changed their diapers, who had sat up countless nights when they had fevers, who had sacrificed everything, my career, my dreams, my youth, to give them the best possible life. The woman who had supported Emily through her divorce, who had co-signed James's student loans when the bank wouldn't approve him a loan, who had been their constant, their foundation, their safety net for 42 years. That woman had been discarded like trash. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely get my phone out of my purse. Emily's number, the same number I'd called 1,000 times to check if she needed anything, if the grandchildren were okay, if she wanted me to bring dinner over. The phone rang once, twice, 5 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Emily. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." Her voice bright and cheerful, the same voice that used to call me Mommy and beg for one more bedtime story. "Emily, it's Mom. I'm standing in the driveway. What is this? What's happening? Please call me back, please." My voice cracked on that last word, the desperation bleeding through despite my efforts to sound calm. I tried James next. My son, my baby boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. The call went straight to voicemail. He'd blocked my number. The silence that followed was deafening. No cars driving by, no neighbors visible, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of air conditioners working against the July heat. I was completely, utterly alone. I walked up to the front door, my front door, painted the soft blue I'd chosen 3 summers ago when Emily said it looked too dated. My key still fit the lock, but when I turned it and pushed, nothing happened. They'd changed the deadbolt. Through the front window, I could see into what used to be my living room. Empty. The furniture I'd carefully chosen over decades. The photographs that covered every surface. The little tchotchkes I'd collected from family vacations. All gone. The walls were bare, painted a stark white that erased every trace of the life I'd built there. It was as if Helen Carter had never existed. I sank down onto the front steps, the same steps where I'd taught Emily to tie her shoes, where James had posed for prom pictures, where Robert and I had shared our morning coffee on lazy Saturday mornings. The concrete was cold against my legs despite the heat, and I found myself staring at my own hands that showed every one of my 67 years, marked with age spots and lines that told the story of a life spent serving others. Had I been that much of a burden, that forgettable, that easy to erase? The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Christmas mornings when I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. assembling toys, wrapping presents, preparing the perfect holiday breakfast. School plays where I'd sat in uncomfortable auditorium chairs for hours, just to see Emily sing one song in the children's choir. James's baseball games where I'd cheered from the bleachers even when he spent most of the time on the bench. Every sacrifice I'd made had felt worth it because I was building something, a family, a legacy, a place where I mattered. But sitting there on those steps, surrounded by the physical evidence of my ejection from their lives, I realized the truth I'd been too blind to see. I had never been building anything at all. I had been slowly erasing myself piece by piece until there was nothing left to remember. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. I knew I couldn't sit here forever. I needed a plan, a place to go, something to do with the wreckage of my life that was slowly cooking in the summer heat. But for that moment, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. My children, the people I loved more than my own life, had thrown me away. I spent that first night in a motel off Interstate 75, staring at the water-stained ceiling while the neon sign outside flickered red and blue through thin curtains. My suitcases sat unopened on the scratchy carpet, as if opening them would make this nightmare real. The musty smell of cigarettes and industrial cleaner couldn't mask the scent of my own clothes, lavender fabric softener I'd used for years, now carrying the bitter irony of domesticity torn away. 42 years. That's how long I'd been Emily and James's mother. 42 years of putting their needs before my own, of building my identity around being the woman who never said no, who always had dinner ready, who sacrificed everything so they could have more. The memories flooded back in waves, each one now tainted with the cruel knowledge of where it had all led. Emily's wedding 8 years ago. I'd spent my entire retirement fund, $23,000 I'd saved penny by penny from my part-time job at the library, to give her the dream wedding she deserved. "Oh, Mom, you don't have to do that," she'd said. But her eyes had lit up when I handed her the check. The venue she wanted, the flowers, the photographer who charged more than I made in 6 months. I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner for months afterward, but seeing her walk down that aisle in the dress of her dreams had felt worth every sacrifice. At the reception, she'd barely spoken to me, too busy with her new in-laws, too caught up in being the perfect bride. When I'd tried to talk to her during the mother-daughter dance, she'd whispered, "Mom, you're crushing my dress," and pulled away. I should have seen the sign then. But I told myself it was just wedding stress, that she'd appreciate everything I'd done once the excitement wore off. James's business venture 3 years ago, he'd come to me with such passion in his eyes, explaining his idea for a landscaping company. "I just need $15,000 to get started, Mom. I'll pay you back with interest, I promise." His voice had been so earnest, so full of hope. How could I say no to my son's dreams? I'd taken out a home equity loan against the house Robert and I had worked 30 years to pay off, the same house they'd just locked me out of. James had hugged me so tight that day, called me the best mom in the world. Within 6 months, the business had failed. The check I'd been expecting, the repayment he'd promised, never came. When I gently asked about it, he'd looked at me like I was being unreasonable. "Mom, you know I'm struggling right now. I thought you gave me that money because you wanted to help, not because you expected it back. That's what family does." Family. The word had become a weapon they used against me, a way to justify taking everything while giving nothing in return. I'd swallowed my disappointment, told him it was okay, that his happiness mattered more than money. But late at night, when the bills came and I had to choose between groceries and medication, the weight of that sacrifice pressed down on me like a stone in my chest. After Robert died, the pattern had only gotten worse. Grief had made me desperate to hold on to what family I had left, to prove I was still valuable, still needed. When Emily's divorce left her struggling financially, I'd immediately offered to help with her mortgage payments. $200 a month for 3 years. Money I couldn't afford to give, taken from my modest Social Security checks. Just until I get back on my feet, she'd promised. But her feet never seemed to find solid ground, and my offers to stop the payments were met with tears and accusations that I didn't care about my own daughter's well-being. The grandchildren, little Sarah and Michael, had become my everything after Robert passed. Every weekend, they'd stay with Grandma Helen while Emily worked or went out with friends. I'd plan elaborate activities, buy toys I couldn't afford, make their favorite meals from scratch. Those bright little faces had been the only light in my world of grief. But gradually, the visits became less frequent. Emily would make excuses. The kids were busy with activities. They had sleepovers to attend. She'd made other plans. When I'd ask to take them to the zoo or the movies, Emily would get that distant look in her eyes. "Mom, you spoil them too much. They need structure, not constant entertainment. Structure, as if love was somehow harmful to them, as if their grandmother's affection was something to be rationed and controlled." The phone calls had dwindled too. Where I used to talk to Emily several times a week, our conversations became monthly, then occasional. James barely called at all unless he needed something. Help with his rent, money for car repairs, someone to watch his apartment while he was out of town. I'd started to feel like a bank that occasionally dispensed emotional support rather than a mother. But I'd told myself it was normal, that adult children got busy with their own lives. I'd convinced myself that my value lay in what I could provide, not who I was. The warning signs had been everywhere, but I'd chosen to ignore them. Like when I'd called Emily last Christmas morning, excited to hear about the gifts the children had opened, only to learn they'd celebrated without me. "We decided to have a quiet holiday this year, Mom. Just our little family. Our little family." As if I wasn't part of it anymore. Or when James had gotten engaged 6 months ago and I'd learned about it from a Facebook post. When I'd called to congratulate him, he'd sounded annoyed that I'd found out. "We're keeping it low-key, Mom. No big announcement or anything." But apparently, it had been big enough to post on social media for everyone except his mother to see. I'd made excuses for them because the alternative, accepting that I'd become an inconvenience in their lives, was too painful to bear. It was easier to blame myself, to think I wasn't trying hard enough, giving enough, being enough. Lying in that motel bed, listening to trucks rumble past on the highway, I finally understood the truth. I had trained them to treat me this way. For 42 years, I'd taught them that my needs didn't matter, that my feelings were less important than theirs, that I existed solely to serve their purposes. I'd been so afraid of losing their love that I'd accepted their indifference, so desperate to be needed that I'd allowed them to use me, so committed to being the perfect mother that I'd forgotten to be a whole person, the woman who had given up her career as a nurse because Robert thought mothers should stay home, the woman who had never taken a vacation that wasn't centered around her children's interests, the woman who had worn the same winter coat for 15 years because every extra dollar went to their needs. That woman had disappeared so gradually, so completely, that even I had forgotten she'd ever existed. Was I used? The question echoed in my mind like a curse I couldn't shake. The answer was yes, but the harder truth was that I had allowed it. I had been complicit in my own erasure, so focused on being indispensable that I'd made myself disposable instead. As dawn broke through the motel curtains, painting everything in harsh fluorescent light, I made a decision. I couldn't undo 42 years of mistakes, couldn't take back all the times I'd said yes when I should have said no, but I could stop making the same mistake today. 3 days after finding my life in suitcases, I was sitting in a Denny's at 2 a.m., nursing my third cup of coffee and watching the night shift waitress refill sugar dispensers with the mechanical precision of someone who'd given up on sleep years ago. The vinyl booth was cracked and patched with duct tape, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry insects. But it was warm, and I could sit here for hours without anyone asking questions. I'd tried calling Emily 17 times. Each ring felt like a small death, each voicemail a knife twisting deeper into wounds that were already infected with 42 years of accumulated neglect. "Emily, please. I don't understand what I did wrong. Just talk to me." "Sweetheart, it's Mom again. I know you're angry, but we can work this out." "Emily, I'm scared. I don't know where to go. Please don't do this." My voice had gotten smaller with each message, more desperate, more pathetic. The proud woman who had raised 2 children, who had managed a household, who had worked part-time while caring for an ailing husband. That woman was disappearing into the static of unanswered phone calls. James's voicemail was worse because it was clearly deliberate. Every time I called, it went straight to that automated message that meant he'd blocked my number entirely. Not even the courtesy of rejection, just digital silence that felt colder than any argument could have been. I'd driven past Emily's house that second day, a modest colonial in a subdivision 40 minutes from where I used to live. Her car was in the driveway, and I could see lights on in the kitchen. Normal life continuing behind those walls while I sat in my Honda Civic like a stalker, wondering if my own daughter would call the police if she saw me. The children, Sarah, 8 years old, and Michael, 6, would be getting ready for school. I wondered if they'd asked where Grandma Helen was, if Emily had told them I was visiting friends, or if she'd simply erased me from their world like I'd never existed. Michael had been learning to read the last time I'd seen him, sounding out words with the careful concentration of someone discovering magic. "Grandma Helen," he'd said, pointing to a card he'd made me for my birthday 6 months ago. "I love you," written in green crayon, backwards E's and all. I still had that card in my purse. It was probably worth more than everything else I owned now. On the 3rd morning, I'd finally worked up the courage to call Emily's work. The receptionist at the dental office where she worked as a hygienist had a sweet voice, the kind that made you want to confide your troubles. "Oh, Mrs. Carter, Emily talks about you all the time. Let me get her for you." The lie was so casual, so automatic, that it took my breath away. Emily talks about me all the time. What did she say? That her mother was a burden she was trying to shed? That the woman who had given her everything was finally being thrown away? "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. Emily says she's with a patient and can't come to the phone right now. Can I take a message?" Another lie. I could hear voices in the background, casual conversation, the sound of people who weren't frantically dealing with dental emergencies. Emily was there, choosing not to speak to me, asking her coworker to lie for her. Just tell her I called," I managed, my voice cracking on the words. "Of course. Have a wonderful day." A wonderful day. As if wonderful days were still possible when your children had amputated you from their lives with surgical precision. That afternoon, I'd done something I never thought I'd do. I'd driven to the senior center downtown, the one with the faded sign and the smell of institutional food that I'd always pitied from the outside. The woman at the front desk had kind eyes behind thick glasses, and when I asked about temporary assistance programs, she didn't make me feel ashamed for needing help at 67 years old. "We see this more often than you'd think," she said gently, sliding a pamphlet across the desk. "Adult children who forget that their parents are people too. You're not alone in this. Not alone." The words should have been comforting, but they only highlighted how completely isolated I'd become. If this happened often enough for senior centers to have pamphlets about it, what did that say about the world we lived in? What did it say about the children we'd raised? The temporary housing list was 3 months long. The Emergency Assistance Fund could provide maybe 2 weeks in a cheap motel. After that, I was on my own with my Social Security check and whatever dignity I could scrape together. I'd sat in that parking lot for an hour afterward, staring at the pamphlet titled "When Family Support Breaks Down," and wondering how I'd become the kind of person who needed to read it. That night, back in the motel room that was starting to feel like a prison cell, I'd made a discovery that shattered what was left of my composure. Going through my purse to count what little money I had left, I'd found a piece of paper I didn't remember putting there. A bank statement that must have fallen out when I'd grabbed my mail before the vacation. Emily's name was on my checking account. I'd added her years ago after Robert died, because she'd convinced me it was practical. What if something happens to you, Mom? What if you can't access your accounts? I just want to be able to help if there's an emergency. An emergency. This was apparently the emergency she'd been preparing for. The emergency of needing to remove her inconvenient mother from her life. The statement showed withdrawal after withdrawal, each one authorized by Emily's signature. Small amounts at first, 50 here, 100 there. Then larger sums. My modest savings, accumulated over decades of careful budgeting, had been drained systematically over the past 6 months. The last withdrawal was dated the day before my vacation. $500, everything that was left except for the $53 in change I had in my wallet. I'd funded my own abandonment, paid for the very betrayal that was destroying me. I dropped the statement like it was on fire, watching it flutter to the stained motel carpet. And for the first time since finding my belongings in the driveway, I couldn't hold back the sound that was clawing its way out of my throat. It wasn't crying. Crying was too soft a word for the noise that came out of me. It was the sound of something breaking that couldn't be fixed, something dying that had taken too long to realize it was already dead. I pressed my face into the scratchy pillowcase and let it out. All of it. 42 years of swallowed disappointments, of excused neglect, of love given freely and returned with calculation. The woman in the room next door pounded on the wall, shouting something about people trying to sleep, but I couldn't stop. The sound was bigger than I was, older than my grief, deeper than the specific cruelty of what Emily and James had done. When it finally ended, I felt hollow, but somehow cleaner, like a wound that had finally been properly drained. I picked up the bank statement and read it again, this time with eyes that weren't clouded by the desperate need to make excuses for my children. This hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been an emergency. It had been theft, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of family obligation and maternal guilt. Emily had been planning this for months. While I'd been mourning my husband, while I'd been trying to rebuild some kind of life from the ashes of 43 years of marriage, while I'd been clinging to my children as the only anchors I had left, she'd been systematically removing my ability to survive independently. The vacation had been the final move in a chess game I hadn't even known I was playing. Get me out of the house long enough to clear out my belongings, change the locks, and present me with the fait accompli of my disposal. I was 67 years old. I had no home, no savings, no family, and apparently no legal recourse against children who'd learned to steal from their mother with her own signature. But lying there in that motel bed, surrounded by the debris of my former life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anger. Pure, clean, clarifying anger that burned away the fog of self-doubt and maternal guilt that had kept me trapped for so long. They had made one mistake. In their haste to erase me, in their confidence that I was too weak and too defeated to fight back, they had underestimated the woman they'd spent 42 years taking for granted. Helen Carter was finished being a victim. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 8 days after I'd found my life packed in suitcases. I'd been awake for hours anyway, staring at the water stain on the motel ceiling that had started to look like a map of my failures, when my phone buzzed with Emily's number. For a moment, I felt that old flutter of hope, the pathetic maternal instinct that insisted my daughter had finally come to her senses, that she was calling to apologize, to explain that this had all been some terrible misunderstanding. "Mom." Her voice was cold, efficient, the tone she used with difficult patients at the dental office. "We need to talk." "Emily, sweetheart, thank God you—" "Don't!" The word cut through my relief like a blade. "Just don't. We need to meet. This has gone on long enough." She gave me an address, a coffee shop downtown that I'd never heard of, the kind of neutral territory people chose when they expected conflict. An hour later, I was sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee I couldn't afford, watching my daughter walk through the door like a stranger who happened to share my DNA. Emily looked good. Better than good, actually. Her hair was professionally styled, her clothes expensive-looking, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. She moved with the confidence of someone whose life was going exactly according to plan, someone who wasn't sleeping in a motel room and counting quarters for coffee. She sat down across from me without embracing, without even making eye contact initially. When she finally looked up, her blue eyes, Robert's eyes, the ones I'd once kissed away tears and nightmares, were as cold as winter sky. James will be here in a few minutes, she said, checking her phone. We thought it would be better to handle this together. Handle this. As if I were a problem to be solved rather than their mother who was drowning in the chaos they'd created. Emily? I don't understand what I did wrong. Please, just tell me. What you did wrong? Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Mom, you're 67 years old. You need to stop acting like a child. The words hit me like a physical blow. In all my years of mothering, through tantrums and teenage rebellion and adult disappointments, Emily had never spoken to me with such casual cruelty. We're not doing this anymore, she continued, her voice taking on the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this speech. The guilt trips, the constant neediness, the way you make everything about yourself, we're done. I make everything about myself? The question came out as a whisper, because louder would have meant screaming, and I wasn't ready to give her the satisfaction of seeing me completely break down in public. The wedding, she said, ticking off grievances on her perfectly manicured fingers. You made such a production of paying for it, constantly reminding everyone how much you'd sacrificed. It was supposed to be my day, but somehow it became all about what a martyr you were. My mouth fell open. The wedding I'd bankrupted myself to give her, the months of peanut butter dinners so she could have flowers from the most expensive florist in town. In her mind, I was the villain of that story. And James's business. God, Mom, the way you passive-aggressively brought up that loan every time you saw him, making him feel guilty for trying to build something for himself. I started, but she held up her hand. You did. Maybe not with words, but with looks, with sighs, with that martyred expression you get when you think no one's paying attention to your sacrifices. James walked in then, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. My baby boy, now 38 years old with graying temples and his father's reluctant walk, slid into the booth next to Emily like he was joining a business meeting rather than confronting his mother. Hi, Mom, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. James. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to hide them in my lap. Can you please explain to me what's happening? I've been calling. I've been trying to understand. Look, Emily interrupted, clearly the spokesperson for this intervention. We know you're upset, but this is actually the best thing for everyone. You've been living in the past, clinging to us like we're still children. It's not healthy. I've been loving you, I said, and even I could hear how desperate that sounded. You've been suffocating us, James said quietly, speaking for the first time. Every conversation, every visit, it's like you're keeping score of everything you've ever done for us. Like we owe you something. You do owe me something. The words were out before I could stop them, raw and honest, and apparently unforgivable. I gave you everything, everything I had, everything I was. I gave up my career, my dreams, my entire identity to raise you both. And yes, you owe me some basic respect, some consideration, some acknowledgement that I'm a human being who deserves better than being thrown away like garbage. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily and James exchanged a look, the kind of knowing glance that excluded me completely, that reminded me I was now an outsider in my own family. There it is, Emily said softly. Do you hear yourself, Mom? Everything is about what you gave up, what you sacrificed, what we owe you. That's not love. That's emotional manipulation. Emotional manipulation? I felt like I was speaking a foreign language, like the words coming out of my mouth weren't connecting to anything real. Taking care of your children is emotional manipulation? The way you did it is, James said, his voice gaining strength. The guilt, the constant reminders of your sacrifices, the way you made us feel responsible for your unhappiness. Dad used to talk about it, you know, how you turned motherhood into martyrdom. Robert. They were bringing Robert into this, using my dead husband's voice to justify their cruelty. The man who had loved me, who had held me when the children were difficult, who had appreciated the sacrifices I'd made. They were claiming he'd criticized me behind my back. Your father never said any such thing, I managed. He did, Mom, Emily said, and there was something almost gentle in her voice now, which somehow made it worse. He worried about you, about how you defined yourself completely through us, how you never developed your own interests or friendships. He said it wasn't fair to put that kind of pressure on your children. The coffee shop around us was filling with morning customers. Business people grabbing caffeine before work, students with laptops, normal people living normal lives while mine disintegrated in real time. I envied every single one of them. "So this is what?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "This is you setting me free? Stealing my money and locking me out of my house is some kind of favor?" "We didn't steal anything," Emily said quickly, the first crack in her composure. "You gave me access to that account. You said I should use it if there was an emergency." "An emergency," I repeated. "Getting rid of your mother was an emergency? Supporting ourselves while you figured out how to be independent was an emergency," James said. "Do you have any idea how expensive it's been taking care of you all these years?" Taking care of me. I thought of the mortgage payments Emily had stopped making after Robert died, the bills I'd juggled to keep giving her money. I thought of the business loan James had never repaid, the rent money I'd provided when he was between jobs for 8 months, the groceries I'd bought, the grandchildren's clothes and toys and school supplies that had come from my dwindling savings. Taking care of me? The question came out as a laugh, high and sharp and unstable. "James, I gave you $15,000 3 years ago. Emily, I've been paying part of your mortgage for 5 years. When exactly were you taking care of me?" "That's what we're talking about," Emily said. "You keep track of everything. You turn gifts into debts, love into obligation. It's exhausting." They were rewriting history in real time, transforming my sacrifices into character flaws, my love into pathology. The woman who had worked double shifts to pay for their college was now the villain who kept too careful an accounting of her generosity. "We've talked to someone," James said suddenly. "A counselor. She helped us understand that this kind of enmeshment isn't healthy for any of us." A counselor. They'd been in therapy, discussing me, analyzing our relationship, reaching the professional conclusion that I was the problem that needed to be solved. "You went to therapy about me?" I asked. "We went to therapy about us," Emily corrected, "about how to establish healthy boundaries with a parent who can't let go." Healthy boundaries. The phrase felt like acid in my ears. Apparently, healthy boundaries involved changing locks and stealing bank accounts and abandoning your mother without warning. "So this is permanent?" I asked, because I needed to hear them say it. "You're just done with me?" "We're done with the old dynamic," Emily said carefully. "If you can learn to respect our boundaries, to have a relationship that isn't based on guilt and obligation, then maybe we can try again someday." Someday. A nebulous future that would arrive only after I'd transformed myself into someone who needed nothing, wanted nothing, expected nothing. Someone who could love them without keeping score, who could give without any hope of receiving. Someone who wasn't me. "And until then?" I asked. "Until then, you need to give us space," James said. "No more calls, no more showing up at our houses or workplaces. We'll contact you when we're ready." I sat there for a moment, absorbing the completeness of my rejection. They'd thought of everything, planned for every contingency, even prepared therapeutic justifications for their cruelty. But as I looked at them, my children, who I'd loved with every cell in my body, I realized something had shifted inside me during this conversation. The desperate, pleading woman who'd made those 17 phone calls was disappearing, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Someone who was tired of begging for scraps of affection from people who viewed her love as a burden. "Okay," I said quietly, standing up from the booth. "I understand." They both looked surprised, as if they'd expected more of a fight, more tears, more of the emotional manipulation they'd accused me of. "I understand completely," I repeated, and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. The law office of Mitchell and Associates sat on the 3rd floor of a renovated Victorian building downtown, its brass nameplate polished to a mirror shine that reflected my determined face back at me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't looking at a broken woman. The person staring back had purpose. I'd found Sarah Mitchell through the senior center, a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases, someone who understood that family cruelty often wore the mask of concern. Her receptionist, a kind woman with silver hair and knowing eyes, had squeezed me into the schedule the same day I called. Financial elder abuse by adult children is more common than people think, Sarah had said during our phone conversation. And unfortunately, the victims often blame themselves instead of recognizing it for what it is. Theft. Theft. The word had power when spoken by someone who understood the law, someone who could separate legal facts from family emotions. The waiting room was quiet except for the soft tick of an antique clock and the rustle of pages as other clients reviewed documents. I sat with my manila folder, bank statements, the joint account paperwork, Emily's signature authorizing withdrawal after withdrawal, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope backed by action. Mrs. Carter? Sarah Mitchell emerged from her office. A woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the kind of firm handshake that suggested she'd fought plenty of battles and won most of them. Please, come in. Her office was lined with law books and certificates. But what caught my attention was a framed photograph on her desk. An elderly woman with Sarah's eyes, smiling in a garden full of roses. My mother, Sarah said, noticing my gaze. She's why I do this work. Too many families forget that their parents are people, not just sources of inheritance to be managed. I opened my folder with hands that barely trembled now. The bank statements that had once made me sob in a motel room were now evidence, documentation of systematic financial abuse that had legal remedies. Tell me everything, Sarah said, settling behind her desk with a legal pad. Start from the beginning. So I did. I told her about Robert's death, about adding Emily to the account for emergencies, about the gradual withdrawals that had accelerated over the past 6 months. I showed her the final statement. The account drained to $53 while I was away on vacation. And the house? Sarah asked, making notes. They changed the locks while I was gone. Everything I owned was packed and left in the driveway. Sarah's pen paused. The house is in your name? Joint ownership with Robert originally. After he died, it became solely mine. Emily's not on the deed, but she had access to your bank accounts. Yes. I added her 5 years ago after Robert died. She said it was just for emergencies in case something happened to me. Sarah leaned back in her chair, and I saw something shift in her expression. The look of a prosecutor who'd just realized how strong her case was. Mrs. Carter, what your daughter has done is called financial exploitation of an elderly person. In this state, it's not just a civil matter, it's a felony. Felony. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that went far beyond family dynamics and hurt feelings. I don't want her to go to jail, I said quickly. I just want— What do you want? Sarah asked gently. The question stopped me cold. For so long, I'd defined my wants in terms of what others needed from me, what would make my children happy, what would keep the peace. What did Helen Carter actually want? I want my money back, I said slowly. I want to be able to live independently without begging anyone for help, and I want them to understand that what they did was wrong. We can accomplish the first 2, Sarah said. The third, well, that's between you and them. She explained the process, filing a police report, documenting the financial abuse, pursuing both criminal charges and civil restitution. It would take time, maybe months, but the law was clear. Adult children couldn't simply drain their parents' accounts, even with authorized access. There's something else, I said, pulling out another document I'd found among my papers. Emily's been receiving money from me for years. Mortgage payments, emergency funds, groceries for the grandchildren. I have records of all of it. Sarah examined the check stubs and money transfer receipts I'd kept with the obsessive organization of someone who'd grown up understanding that every dollar mattered. How much total? I'd done the math during one of my sleepless motel nights, adding up years of financial support with the precision of an accountant. $43,000 over the past 5 years. Sarah whistled softly. That changes things significantly. We're not just talking about the bank account anymore. We're talking about a pattern of financial exploitation spanning years. For the first time since finding my belongings in the driveway, I felt like someone was taking my side. Someone was saying that what had happened to me was wrong, that I deserved better, that the law would protect me even when my family wouldn't. What's the next step? I asked. We file the paperwork today. Police report, civil suit, and a restraining order to prevent any further financial contact until this is resolved. And, Mrs. Carter? Sarah looked at me directly. You need to understand that once we start this process, there's no going back. Your relationship with your children will never be the same. I thought about Emily's cold eyes across that coffee shop table, about James's casual cruelty, about the therapeutic justifications for abandoning their mother. I thought about the grandchildren who would grow up not knowing that their grandmother had loved them enough to sacrifice everything. It's already not the same, I said. They made sure of that. 3 hours later, I walked out of the police station with a case number and a detective's business card. Officer Maria Rodriguez had listened to my story with the professional sympathy of someone who'd heard similar tales too many times. Ma'am, I see this a lot, she'd said while typing up my statement. Adult kids who think their parents' money is somehow already theirs. The good news is that you kept excellent records. That's going to make our job much easier. That evening, I sat in my motel room with takeout Chinese food and a legal document that felt like armor. A temporary restraining order requiring Emily and James to have no contact with me or my finances until the court case was resolved. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I was going to get back. My phone rang at 9:47 p.m., Emily's number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again 5 minutes later, then again. Then James called. Then Emily again. I turned the phone off and ate my lo mein in blessed silence, savoring each bite with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally stopped begging for scraps and started demanding a seat at the table. The voicemails could wait. Let them panic a little. Let them wonder what Helen Carter was doing, what she was planning, what the woman they'd discarded was capable of when she finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The next morning, I checked my messages. 17 calls, 8 voicemails, and a series of increasingly frantic texts. Mom, we need to talk. Call me immediately. What did you do? The police called Emily. Call me. Mom, please. Let's work this out as a family. Don't involve outsiders. You're being ridiculous. Over money? Really? Fine. If this is how you want to play it, don't expect us to be there when you really need us. That last message made me laugh out loud. A sound that surprised me with its genuine warmth. When I really needed them? I'd needed them when I was grieving Robert's death. I'd needed them when I was struggling financially. I'd needed them when I found myself homeless and abandoned. Where had they been then? I deleted the messages without responding and got dressed for my second appointment with Sarah Mitchell. We had evidence to organize, witness statements to collect, and a case to build. For the first time in 67 years, Helen Carter was fighting back. And it felt like coming alive. The court hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a crisp October morning, 6 weeks after I'd filed the lawsuit. I woke up at dawn in my new studio apartment, a modest place I'd found with Sarah's help, furnished with basics from thrift stores and charity donations. It wasn't much, but it was mine, paid for with the emergency funds Sarah had helped me access through victims' assistance programs. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing the navy blue dress I'd worn to Robert's funeral. Dignified, serious, respectful. As I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw a woman I was still getting reacquainted with. The desperate, pleading person who'd called Emily 17 times had been replaced by someone with clear eyes and steady hands. The courthouse was an imposing granite building downtown, its marble floors echoing with the footsteps of people seeking justice. Sarah met me at the security checkpoint, carrying a briefcase thick with evidence and wearing the confident expression of a lawyer who knew she had a winning case. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we walked toward the courtroom. "Ready," I said, and meant it. Emily and James were already seated at the defendant's table with their lawyer, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s who kept checking his expensive watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. My children looked different than they had at that coffee shop confrontation. Emily's usual polished appearance showed cracks. Her makeup was too heavy, trying to hide dark circles under her eyes. James fidgeted constantly, his leg bouncing under the table with nervous energy. They both turned when I walked in, and I saw something in their faces I'd never seen before. Fear. Not the comfortable fear of disappointing Mom or dealing with her emotional reactions, but real fear of consequences they couldn't control or manipulate. All rise for the Honorable Judge Catherine Walsh, the bailiff announced. Judge Walsh was a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variation of human selfishness and wasn't impressed by any of it. She reviewed the case file with quick efficiency before looking up at both tables. "This is a civil case involving allegations of financial elder abuse," she began. "Mrs. Carter, through her attorney, alleges that her adult children systematically drained her bank accounts and removed her from her home without legal authority. The defendants claim they were acting within their rights as authorized account holders and concerned family members." Sarah stood to present our case, her voice clear and professional as she laid out the timeline of abuse. Bank records projected on a screen showed the pattern of withdrawals, starting small and accelerating over the final months. The court saw how Emily had drained the account completely while I was on vacation, timing the final theft to coincide with my removal from the house. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "this case represents a textbook example of financial exploitation. Mrs. Carter trusted her daughter with emergency access to her accounts, and that trust was systematically betrayed for personal gain. The numbers were stark when displayed in court. $43,000 over 5 years. The vacation timed perfectly to facilitate the final clearing of my accounts. The changed locks that prevented me from accessing my own property. When Emily took the stand, she looked smaller somehow, less sure of herself than she'd been during our coffee shop confrontation. Under cross-examination, the therapeutic justifications and boundary-setting language fell apart. "Ms. Morrison," Sarah said, using Emily's married name with deliberate formality, "did you have your mother's explicit permission to withdraw the final $500 from her account?" "I had access to the account," Emily replied, her voice barely audible. "That wasn't the question. Did you have her permission for that specific withdrawal?" "No." "Did you inform her that you were planning to remove her belongings from the house?" "We thought it would be easier." "Yes or no, Ms. Morrison? Did you inform her?" "No." "Did you give her any notice that you were changing the locks on her property?" Emily's lawyer objected, but Judge Walsh overruled him. "Answer the question." "No." When James testified, he tried to maintain the narrative they'd constructed about my emotional manipulation, but under legal scrutiny, their justifications sounded exactly like what they were: excuses for theft and abandonment. "Mr. Carter," Sarah pressed, "you received a $15,000 loan from your mother 3 years ago for a business venture. Did you repay that loan?" "The business failed. She knew there were risks." "Did you repay the loan? Yes or no?" "No." "Did you make any attempt to establish a payment plan or acknowledge the debt?" "No." "And during the time you were unable to repay this debt, did you take family vacations?" James's lawyer objected again, but Judge Walsh allowed the question. "Yes," James admitted. "Did you purchase a new car?" "Yes." "A boat?" "Yes, but thank you." No further questions. When their lawyer tried to present the defense case, it fell apart under the weight of documented evidence. They couldn't explain away the bank records, couldn't justify the systematic draining of my accounts, couldn't provide any legal basis for removing me from my own property. Their counselor, the one who'd apparently helped them understand their need for healthy boundaries, testified via video call. Under cross-examination, she admitted she'd only heard their side of the story, had never spoken with me, and wasn't qualified to provide financial or legal advice. "So your recommendation for no contact was based entirely on your client's description of their relationship with their mother?" Sarah asked. "Well, yes, but..." "And you never suggested family mediation, gradual boundary setting, or any other approach that didn't involve complete abandonment?" My clients seemed very clear about what they needed. What they needed. Even their therapist spoke about me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be considered. The most devastating testimony came from Detective Rodriguez, who explained the criminal investigation that was proceeding parallel to the civil case. Financial elder abuse wasn't just a family disagreement. It was a felony that carried serious legal consequences. "Based on our investigation," she testified, "we found evidence of systematic financial exploitation spanning multiple years. The defendants had no legal right to the funds they withdrew, regardless of their access to the accounts." When Judge Walsh called for closing arguments, Sarah's summary was calm and factual. She didn't need to be dramatic because the evidence spoke for itself. Emily and James's lawyer tried to paint me as a manipulative mother who'd created an unhealthy dynamic, but even he seemed to recognize how weak their position was. You can't steal someone's money because you think they're emotionally needy. Judge Walsh deliberated for less than 20 minutes. In the matter of Carter v. Morrison and Carter, she announced when court reconvened. I find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. The words hit me like a physical force. Relief so powerful I had to grip the table to keep from falling. The defendants are ordered to pay full restitution of $43,000 plus court costs and penalties for a total of $58,000. They have 30 days to comply or face additional legal action. But Judge Walsh wasn't finished. I want to address something that concerns me deeply about this case, she continued, looking directly at Emily and James. This court sees many family disputes, but rarely have I encountered such calculated cruelty disguised as concern. Mrs. Carter trusted you with access to her financial resources for emergency purposes. You exploited that trust systematically and then abandoned her when she became inconvenient. Emily was crying now, but they weren't the manipulative tears she'd used so effectively throughout our lives. These were the tears of someone facing real consequences for the first time. The court also notes that the defendants have shown no remorse for their actions, instead attempting to justify theft as boundary setting. This behavior demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding about both family obligations and basic human decency. As we left the courthouse, Emily and James tried to approach me. Their lawyer quickly steered them away. But not before I heard Emily call out, "Mom, please, we can work this out. We can work this out." The same words she'd used in that coffee shop, when she'd been in control, when she'd thought I was too weak and broken to fight back. But now, the power dynamic had shifted completely. They needed something from me. My forgiveness, my willingness to drop the criminal charges, my agreement to keep this quiet so their reputations wouldn't be destroyed. For the first time in 42 years, my children needed me more than I needed them. Sarah and I walked down the courthouse steps together, the autumn sun warm on our faces. "How does it feel?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. How did it feel to win? To have my pain validated, my dignity restored, my worth recognized by an impartial system that cared only about facts and justice? "It feels like waking up," I said finally. That evening, I sat in my small apartment with a glass of wine I could afford, looking at the court documents that proved what I'd always known but never been able to make others understand. I deserved better. The phone rang, Emily's number, but I didn't rush to answer it anymore. Those days were over. Helen Carter had found her voice, and it was strong enough to demand respect. 6 months after the court victory, I was standing in the paint aisle of Home Depot, holding color swatches against the morning light streaming through the store's skylights. Sage green, ocean breeze, morning mist, names that promised transformation and new beginnings. For the first time in decades, I was choosing colors not because they were practical, or because someone else preferred them, but because they made me smile. The house I'd found was a small cottage on Maple Street, built in the 1940s with original hardwood floors and windows that caught the light just right in the afternoon. It wasn't grand. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that needed updating, but it was mine. Completely. Legally. Undeniably mine. No joint ownership, no authorized users, no one who could take it away. I'd paid cash with the restitution money from the lawsuit, plus the funds Sarah had helped me recover from accounts Emily had hidden. The final settlement had been larger than the initial judgment. James and Emily's attempt to hide assets had backfired spectacularly when the forensic accountant found investments they'd made with my money. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Carol, who specialized in helping seniors downsize, had been surprised by my specific requirements. "Most clients your age want everything on 1 floor, she'd said when I'd insisted on seeing houses with stairs. "They're thinking about mobility issues." But I'd wanted stairs because I'd wanted the choice to climb them. I'd wanted a 2nd floor that was mine to use or not use, a space that existed because I decided it should exist, not because someone else deemed it necessary for my care and feeding. The house came with a garden that had been neglected for years, its flower beds choked with weeds and volunteer trees. The previous owner's children had lived out of state and couldn't be bothered with maintenance. Looking at those overgrown beds, I'd seen possibility where others saw problems. Now, 3 weeks into living there, I was learning the difference between a house and a home. Every morning, I made coffee in my own kitchen, sitting at my own table, watching my own birds at the feeder I'd hung outside my own window. Simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after months of motel rooms and other people's charity. The phone still rang sometimes. Emily called every few weeks, her voice carefully modulated between contrition and expectation. The conversations followed a predictable pattern. Apologies that stopped just short of admitting wrongdoing, followed by hints that surely we could move past this now that the legal issues were resolved. "Mom, we've learned so much from this experience," she'd said during her most recent call. "Maybe we could try family counseling together. Start fresh. Start fresh." As if 42 years of patterns could be erased with good intentions and professional mediation. As if the woman who'd drained my bank account while I grieved my husband deserved the same trust I'd given her when she was 8 years old and promised to take care of the neighbor's cat. "I'm not ready for that," I'd told her, and was surprised by how easily the boundary came. No elaborate justification, no apology for disappointing her. Just a simple statement of my current reality. "When will you be ready?" she'd pressed, and I'd heard the old familiar edge creeping into her voice, the tone that suggested my feelings were an inconvenience to be managed rather than respected. "I don't know," I'd said. "Maybe never. I haven't decided yet." The silence that followed was telling. Emily wasn't accustomed to maybe never from me. For 4 decades, my love had been unconditional, my forgiveness guaranteed, my availability assumed. The woman who'd raised her had operated from scarcity, afraid of losing their love, afraid of being alone, afraid of standing up for herself. But the woman Emily was trying to manipulate now operated from abundance. I had my own home, my own money, my own life. I didn't need her approval or her presence to feel complete. James had taken a different approach. His calls were shorter, more businesslike, focused on practical matters rather than emotional reconciliation. "I want to pay you back for the business loan," he'd said last month. "With interest. I know money can't fix everything, but it's a start." $15,000 plus 5 years of interest came to nearly $23,000, more than I'd expected, more than the court had ordered for that particular debt. When I'd asked why he was offering more than legally required, his answer had surprised me. "Because I finally calculated what you actually gave up for us," he'd said quietly. "Not just the money, but the career you could have had if you'd kept working as a nurse. The retirement savings you could have built if you hadn't been supporting us all these years. $23,000 doesn't even scratch the surface, but it's what I can manage right now." It was the closest thing to genuine accountability I'd heard from either of my children. Not an excuse dressed up as an apology, not a therapeutic justification for past behavior. Just acknowledgement that their choices had costs that someone else had paid. I'd accepted the payment, but kept the emotional distance. Trust, once broken so completely, couldn't be rebuilt with money alone. My days now followed rhythms I chose rather than responding to other people's emergencies. Mornings in the garden, pulling weeds and planning where to plant the roses I'd always wanted but never had space for. Afternoons reading books I'd checked out from the library, novels I'd never had time for when my life revolved around other people's needs. I joined a book club at the senior center, the same place where I'd once sat with pamphlets about family breakdown and emergency housing. Now I was there by choice, discussing literature with women who'd lived full lives and had opinions about things that had nothing to do with their children's approval. "You're glowing," said Margaret, a retired teacher who'd become something close to a friend. We were sitting in my new living room, drinking tea from cups I'd chosen myself, delicate china with tiny blue flowers that would have been impractical when grandchildren visited regularly. "I'm sleeping through the night," I told her. 8 hours straight without waking up, worried about who needs what from me. It was true. The insomnia that had plagued me for years had disappeared almost immediately after moving into the cottage. No more 3 a.m. anxiety about Emily's mortgage payment or James's latest crisis. No more lying awake calculating how to stretch my Social Security check to cover everyone's emergencies. Margaret nodded knowingly. I went through something similar when my daughter moved to California and stopped expecting me to babysit every weekend. Suddenly, I remembered what it felt like to wake up and think about what I wanted to do instead of what everyone else needed. The book club had introduced me to other women with similar stories. Not all as dramatic as mine. Most families were more subtle in their exploitation. But the pattern was familiar. Children who'd learned to see their mothers as resources rather than people. Daughters who'd assumed their mother's time and money were infinitely available. Sons who'd never considered that mom might have her own dreams and limitations. "The thing is," said Patricia, a widow whose son had been borrowing money for 15 years without ever paying it back, "we taught them to treat us that way. We made ourselves so available, so accommodating, that they forgot we were separate people with our own needs." It was a hard truth, but not a bitter one. I had taught Emily and James that my boundaries were negotiable, that my needs were secondary, that my love came without conditions or consequences. I'd been so afraid of losing them that I'd made myself into someone who couldn't be valued. But fear was an exhausting way to live, and I was finally too tired to keep running from the possibility that I might end up alone. The irony was that letting go of my desperate need for their approval had made room for genuine relationships. Margaret and Patricia and the other women in the book club appreciated my company without expecting me to fund their lives or solve their problems. They liked Helen Carter for who she was, not what she could provide. I'd even started dating, something that would have been unthinkable when my identity was entirely wrapped up in being someone's mother. Richard was a retired accountant I'd met at the library, a gentleman whose wife had died 2 years earlier. Our relationship was uncomplicated. Dinner once a week, movies on weekends, companionable silence while we read in the same room. "You're different than I expected," he'd told me on our third date. Most women our age, their whole conversation revolves around their children and grandchildren. You talk about books and gardening and places you want to travel. Travel. Another possibility that had opened up when I'd stopped pouring every spare dollar into my children's endless needs. I'd booked a cruise for the spring, Alaska, something I'd dreamed about for years, but never pursued because the money always seemed needed elsewhere. The cottage was taking shape around me, each room reflecting choices made for my own pleasure rather than other people's convenience. The spare bedroom that could have been set up for visiting grandchildren was instead my art studio, filled with watercolor supplies and canvases where I painted the garden views that changed with each season. Emily had noticed during her last brief visit. "You could put a daybed in here for when Sarah and Michael stay over," she'd suggested, eyeing the easel and paint supplies with obvious disapproval. "They're welcome to visit," I'd said mildly, "but they'll need to sleep on the couch. This is my art room. My art room." The phrase had felt foreign in my mouth, impossibly selfish and wonderfully true. I was 68 years old and finally learning to paint, finally giving myself permission to take up space for purely personal pleasure. The woman who'd once apologized for existing was claiming territory, setting boundaries, living as if her happiness mattered just as much as anyone else's. And somehow, despite everything Emily and James had said about my selfishness and emotional manipulation, the world hadn't ended. The sun still rose each morning, the flowers still bloomed in my garden, and Helen Carter was finally, fully, completely alive. 1 year later, I was sitting on my front porch swing, watching the sun set through the maple trees I'd planted along my property line, when Sarah pulled into my driveway. Not my daughter Sarah, my lawyer Sarah, who had become something much more valuable, a genuine friend. She'd made this visit a monthly tradition, stopping by with takeout Chinese food and updates on other cases like mine. Tonight, she carried a bottle of wine and news that made me set down my watering can with shaking hands. "3 more families this week," she said, settling into the wicker chair I'd positioned to catch the evening breeze. 2 daughters and a son, all using their parents' trust against them. "Word is getting out about your case, Helen. Other people are finding the courage to fight back. 3 more families. The number should have made me sad. More elderly parents discovering that their children viewed them as ATMs with expiration dates. But instead, I felt something closer to pride. My battle, my willingness to stand up and say no more, was creating ripple effects in other lives. The Martinez case goes to trial next month, Sarah continued, opening the wine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to celebrate small victories. 64-year-old mother, 2 sons who drained her retirement account and sold her house while she was in the hospital recovering from surgery. She keeps saying she never would have had the courage to pursue it if she hadn't heard about what you did. Mrs. Martinez. I'd met her at the senior center, a soft-spoken woman who'd cried when she told me about waking up from anesthesia to discover she was homeless. Her sons had power of attorney and had used her medical crisis as an opportunity to liquidate her assets for their own benefit. She's going to win, I said with certainty. The law was clear once you got past the family dynamics and emotional manipulation. Theft was theft, regardless of the relationship between perpetrator and victim. Sarah poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me one. She's going to win because you showed her it was possible. You proved that fighting back doesn't make you a bad mother. It makes you a woman who refuses to disappear. Refuses to disappear. The phrase resonated in ways Sarah probably didn't intend. For so much of my life, I'd been slowly vanishing, erasing my needs, my opinions, my very self in service of keeping everyone else comfortable. The woman who'd raised Emily and James had been a ghost, haunting her own life, so focused on being indispensable that she'd become invisible. But the woman sitting on this porch, sipping wine as the evening air carried the scent of her own roses, was undeniably present. Solid. Real. My phone buzzed with a text message. Emily again. The weekly check-in that had replaced her phone calls after I'd made it clear that lengthy conversations were no longer welcome. Thinking of you, Mom. The kids ask about you. Maybe dinner this weekend? I read the message and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not the old desperate hope that this time things would be different. Just a mild noting of information, like checking the weather forecast or reading a grocery store circular. Emily? Sarah asked, noticing my expression. Still trying to find a way back in, I confirmed, setting the phone aside without responding. She thinks if she's persistent enough, eventually I'll forget what happened and go back to being the mother she remembers. Will you? It was a fair question. Sarah had seen enough family reconciliations go wrong to know that many victims eventually caved to pressure and guilt, returning to dysfunctional patterns because loneliness felt worse than exploitation. No, I said, and was surprised by how easily the word came. I might have dinner with them someday when I'm ready, but I'll never again be the woman who gave everything and expected nothing in return. The truth was, I didn't miss them the way I'd expected to. I missed the children they'd been. 8-year-old Emily reading to her dollhouse, 6-year-old James building elaborate Lego cities and explaining their traffic patterns with intense seriousness. But those children had grown into adults who viewed their mother as a problem to be managed, and I had no nostalgia for being managed. Last month, I'd run into Emily at the grocery store. The encounter had been awkward but illuminating. She'd looked good. Her hair professionally styled, her clothes expensive, her makeup perfect. The financial stress that had supposedly justified draining my accounts appeared to have resolved itself. Mom, you look... She'd paused, searching for words. Different. I'd been wearing jeans and a sweater I'd bought because I liked the color. My haircut in a style that pleased me rather than one that was practical for someone who supposedly had no time for vanity. I'd lost weight since moving to the cottage. Not from stress or poverty, but from walking my neighborhood each morning and eating meals I actually enjoyed, rather than whatever was easiest to prepare for ungrateful recipients. I look happy, I'd said simply. The kids miss their grandmother, Emily had tried, deploying her most effective weapon. And for a moment, I'd felt the old tug. Sarah and Michael, now 9 and 7, who'd been taught that Grandma Helen had gone away and wasn't coming back. Children who'd been used as emotional leverage in an adult conflict they couldn't understand. But then I'd remembered the last Christmas before everything fell apart, when I'd spent my entire holiday budget on gifts for them, and Emily had barely allowed me an hour of their time. I'd remembered birthday parties I wasn't invited to, school plays I wasn't told about, the gradual erasure of my role in their lives that had preceded the final abandonment. They know how to reach me, I'd told Emily. When they're old enough to make their own decisions about relationships, I'll be here. It was a boundary that had taken me months to articulate. I would not compete for access to my grandchildren. I would not beg for scraps of their attention or negotiate for the privilege of loving them. When they were adults, they could decide for themselves whether their grandmother was worth knowing. Sarah interrupted my memories by raising her wine glass. "A toast," she said, "to the ripple effect. To every woman who learns that she deserves better. To Helen Carter, who refused to stay invisible." We clinked glasses as the last light faded from the sky, and the porch light came on automatically, casting a warm glow over the space I'd created for myself. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of evening. Children playing in nearby yards, dogs barking, the ordinary music of a neighborhood settling into night. 6 months ago, I'd received an unexpected visitor. Detective Rodriguez had stopped by to let me know that the criminal case against Emily and James had been resolved. They'd pled guilty to misdemeanor charges and received probation, avoiding jail time, but acquiring criminal records that would follow them for years. "They're lucky," the detective had said. "If they'd done this to a stranger instead of their mother, the charges would have been much more serious." Lucky. The word had stuck with me. Emily and James were lucky that I'd chosen civil court over criminal prosecution. Lucky that I'd been more interested in getting my money back than seeing them imprisoned. They were lucky to have had a mother who'd loved them enough to sacrifice everything, even if they'd been too selfish to value that love appropriately. But I was lucky too, in ways I was still discovering. Lucky to have learned that happiness didn't require other people's approval. Lucky to have found out what I was capable of when I stopped apologizing for taking up space. Lucky to be sitting on my own porch, drinking wine with a friend who valued my company, surrounded by a life I'd built according to my own specifications. The cottage around me held different energy than the house I'd shared with Robert and lost to my children. This space was infused with intention rather than obligation, decorated with things that brought me joy rather than things that were practical for other people's comfort. In my bedroom, I kept a small framed photo, not of Emily and James, but of myself at age 25, standing in my nursing school graduation gown with a smile that promised the world I was ready for anything. That young woman had had dreams and ambitions and a sense of her own worth that had somehow gotten buried under decades of putting everyone else first. I was learning to honor her memory by living the kind of life she would have been proud of. As Sarah and I finished our wine and she prepared to leave, she asked the question that had become our ritual. "Any regrets?" It was something we discussed monthly, her way of checking whether I was second-guessing the choices that had led me here. Early on, the answer had been complicated. Grief for the family relationships I'd lost, uncertainty about whether I'd been too harsh, fear that I might die alone and unloved. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived on my own terms, the answer was simple. "No regrets," I said. "Only gratitude for finding out who I really am when no one else's needs are drowning out my own voice." After Sarah left, I sat on the porch for another hour, listening to the night sounds and thinking about the woman I'd been and the woman I'd become. Somewhere in this city, other elderly parents were lying awake, wondering if they mattered to their children, if their love was valued, if they deserved better treatment than they were receiving. To them, wherever they were, I wanted to say, "You are worth more than what you can provide. Your love should not come with a price tag attached. You deserve respect, consideration, and basic human decency from your children, regardless of what you've given them over the years. And if they can't see your value, if they treat you as a resource rather than a person, if they steal from you and abandon you, and then blame you for their cruelty, you have more power than you know. The law will protect you if you ask for protection. Your worth doesn't depend on their recognition. Your happiness doesn't require their approval. You are not too old to start over. You are not too set in your ways to change. You are not required to accept mistreatment because the people mistreating you share your DNA. You can choose to save yourself, even if no one else will. Have you ever experienced something like this, or do you know someone who has? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind each other that we all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter our age.